Welcome to another edition of OdooSME videos. My name is Dari Matt Obel. Today I'm going to show you how to account for withholding tax in OdooSME. Let's start with the definition. What is withholding tax? Withholding tax is an advance payment of corporate income tax. So what does this mean? Usually, an organization or entity or business is required to pay tax on its profit at the end of the year. So when you file your returns, after you do an audit, the authorities or the tax authorities are then required to deduct the amount of tax as computed from the profit that has been so declared. Now, the taxman does not want to wait until the end of the year when your profit is determined before they can collect this money. So what they've done with withholding tax is to say on a monthly basis, we would like to collect a portion of your tax liability at the end of the year. The way they do that is anytime your customers pay you, they expect your customers to deduct a certain percentage as withholding tax. So basically, it's an amount that is withheld. And your customers will continue to do this on all the goods and services that you render by deducting this withholding tax. And then at the end of the year, or when you want to file your tax returns and pay your tax liability, then you'll be able to use all of these deductions to offset, at least in part, your tax liability. Now take note of the following. Number one, withholding tax is not a final tax. Of course it cannot be, because it has its own percentages. Far from the final liability that is supposed to be paid at the end of the year. So it's not a final tax. Number two thing is that it is usually deducted at the time of payment, generally speaking. I will show you an instance where we can apply withholding tax at the time of invoice. Number three, withholding tax can be deducted by both customers and suppliers of goods and services. So as a company, my customers will deduct withholding tax from my payments. But I'm also required to deduct withholding tax from the payments that I make to my suppliers. The rate of withholding tax can be different depending on the goods or service rendered. So for some claims, it can be 2.5%, it can be 5%. I know, for example, that most goods and services are charged or required to be charged at 5% withholding tax. Of course, there are several other instances where 10% is charged, for example, on rent, on contracts for hire, and so on and so forth. So, but again, this is something that is dependent or that differs from one country to another. This is something that differs from one country to another. So you need to check the tax laws to know which rate applies to the goods and services you render or that you receive from your customers. Now, when it comes to remittance, government usually prescribes that the remittance be done on a monthly basis. So the remittance of withholding tax has to be done on a monthly basis. Now, when the withholding tax is deducted and the money remitted to government, government will issue a receipt. So that means that the withholding tax deducted will be receipted, and that receipt will be handed over to the company from whom or from which the withholding tax is being deducted. Now that receipt will then be used to claim a tax credit at the end of the year. Now, some people have misconstrued withholding tax as a VAT balancer. So let me explain. It is now common practice that when a company gets charged for VAT by its vendors, there's a tendency for the company to now say, well, you know what, if we pay this VAT, then it means that we'll be increasing our cost. So the way to balance it then is to deduct an equivalent amount in withholding tax. Now, this is not exactly right because these two taxes are completely different. Whereas the VAT, as was mentioned in another video, it's the tax on consumption, and this is government money. But the withholding tax is your advance payment of your tax liability, and the money belongs to you. So you cannot use one to offset the other. It's time to practicalize this. Let's get into OdooSME. We will go to the accounting module straight away. And then from the dashboard, let's remind ourselves about how to configure taxes again. So I'll go to configuration and then I go to taxes. Now notice that I have set up a withholding tax orders at 10%. So we'll be talking about withholding tax that is based on a tax scope called purchases. If I provide goods and services to my customers, and then my customers are the ones deducting the withholding tax before they pay my company, then it means that when I'm setting up in my system, I also need to set up a withholding tax that is going to be based on sales. So let me open this up. We've covered this extensively when we're talking about VAT. It's the same principle. Basically, you will see in this first tab that we have a few options. How do you compute the withholding tax? Is it a fixed amount? Is it a percentage of price? Or is it a percentage of price tax included? You want to be reminded about what each of this means, then you need to watch that video that talks about how to account for VAT. It's the same principle basically. For us, it's a percentage of price. Okay? You can put a percent here if it's 2.5%, if it's 5%, 10%, whatever that percentage is, you can include it there. This right hand side is very important, so I'll just explain it a little bit as another reminder. When withholding tax is deducted, we need to indicate which account in the GL that deduction needs to be linked to. So because we are dealing with purchases, imagine what happens. We want to pay our vendors, and then we decide that in compliance with the law, we should deduct withholding tax. When we deduct that money, it becomes a liability because it's the money that belongs to our vendor. We have deducted it and we're supposed to remit to government. So that deduction will go to a payable account. And for this, I have set up an account called withholding tax payable. Now that's all we need to do here. Give it a tax name, e.g. withholding tax, and then indicate the tax scope. Here I've indicated purchases, and then set your price basis, the basis of your tax computation, whether it's a fixed amount. Usually it's going to be a percentage of price. Put that percentage and then link it to accounts in your GL. So I'm going to save that. Okay. In our introduction, we did say that withholding tax is usually deducted at the time of payment. But I also have one good example of where we can apply withholding tax when we receive invoice from our vendors. So I will use this particular withholding tax on rent to explain that possibility later on in the video. Now, let's try and do an invoice, a purchase invoice from our vendor. and then see how the withholding tax works. So I go to purchases, vendor bills. Okay, so I can easily create a new vendor bill. Let's assume that this is to Alpha United, and let's add an item. Okay, general goods and services. Okay, let's just say office consumables. Okay, and the price amount is 60,000. Now, because maybe we should just even add VAT on that. So I'm going to add a 5% VAT. Okay, that's not withholding tax. That is VAT, tax on consumption. Always remember that. So I'm going to save this, and you can see that OdooSME has added the VAT line of 3,000. 5% of 60,000 is 3,000, so 63,000. So far, what the system has shown us is that if I'm going to pay this vendor tomorrow, I will be paying for the service of 60,000. But in addition, the vendor will have added 5% on this invoice amount of 60,000. That is the VAT that I am supposed to pay for the services that I have consumed, because VAT is a consumption tax. So the vendor who is providing the service has billed me 60,000 but has added a VAT of 5%, which is 3,000. Now when I want to pay this invoice, I should actually pay 63,000 because I have an obligation under the tax laws in my country to pay VAT on every goods and services that I consume. So I'm going to pay 63,000. Okay. Now, there is another law, the withholding tax that we're discussing now. That law also says that at the point of payment, I should deduct a certain amount from this vendor's payment on the service that the vendor has rendered. And that amount is going to be an advance payment of corporate income tax. Whatever I'm deducting now is something the vendor will consider as a down payment or advance payment of corporate income tax. Let's assume for once that our withholding tax is 10%. Well, I'm not going to apply the 10% on my 63,000 because that will be doing a withholding tax on the tax or VAT amount as well. So the service rendered was for a value of 60,000. So I'm going to do a 10% withholding tax on 60,000, and that works out to be 6,000. How do I book this? Well, the first thing I want to do in OdooSME is that invoice is still in draft, so let's validate it. Okay. So when I come to the point where I want to make this payment, one of the ways we do payment will be to go directly into the invoice, call up the invoice, it's already shown in the screen, and I then say register payment. So how much do you think that I'm going to pay? So let's go back to this invoice total. So I said I'm going to deduct 10% withholding tax from the service. So 60,000 less 10% will be 60,000 minus 6,000, which is 54,000. Okay. Now, if I paid the VAT, which we agreed we should pay, so it means the total amount I'm supposed to pay this vendor will be 54,000 plus 3,000, which is 57,000. So let me explain again. There is a 10% withholding tax we want to deduct on this service. 10% of 60,000 is 6,000. So that means that if I am paying this vendor for the service only, I will pay 60,000 less the withholding tax of 10%, which is 6,000, and that gives me 54,000. But I'm also supposed to pay the 3,000 VAT that he has charged me, legitimately, of course. So the total payment will then come to 54,000 plus 3,000, which is 57,000. When I want to book this payment, I can straight away go open up the invoice and then click on register payment. Remember, we want to pay 57,000. My payment method is the bank from which I will be paying from. So let's assume it's Zenith Bank. I'm not paying the entire 63,000. I'm going to pay 57,000. Okay, that's what I'm going to pay. And then I say validate. The first option says keep open. Select that option if you want to keep this difference of 6,000, which obviously is the withholding tax. Do you want to keep it open? Do you want to leave it to remain outstanding as something that you are owing the vendor? The truth is that you are no longer owing the vendor. So this needs to go to some account where we can keep track of the fact that that money has actually been deducted. The 57,000 is full and final payment to the vendor, but this 6,000 is something that I'm deducting so that I can pay to government. Because the 57,000 fully settles the vendor, I'm going to choose the option that says mark invoice as fully paid. Now the system is asking me where I would like to post the difference. And obviously, because this has to do with withholding tax. And what kind of withholding tax? It's a payable. This money I am deducting is a payable. If it was my customer that was deducting this payment, it then becomes a withholding tax receivable. So in this example, I'm going to choose withholding tax payable. Okay, and then I just say validate. So presumably, I have been able to take, you see that invoice is marked as paid. Okay, and we can check there's no amount due on this invoice. So that was the 57,000, and then that was the 6,000 that now fully reconciles the invoice of 63,000. Okay, if you want to see the details of this particular transaction in terms of the journal entry, you can go to advisor and then look at journal entries. So let's just read these entries to see if they make sense. So these are the two entries that were booked. So I'm going to take the first one. The first one, obviously, it's a debit to accounts payable, which means I'm reducing my liability to Alpha Limited, and then a credit out of my Zenith Bank account. So that looks correct. The second entry, which is the 6,000, makes a debit to my account payable. Okay, so this debit plus the previous debit of 57,000 now completely nils off the 63,000 I am owing Alpha United. But you then see a credit to withholding tax payable. This will remind us that we owe government 6,000 naira in withholding tax, which was deducted from the vendor. And until I remit that amount, then this particular figure will remain outstanding. So this is a good way to treat deductions of withholding tax from vendor payment. And it can be applied as well to customer payments. Just remember that when you are dealing with customers, then the withholding tax account will be some withholding tax receivable, because they are the ones that are deducting the withholding tax from our payments. Now, the last one I want to show us is withholding tax on rent. Let me explain the dilemma. Particularly in Nigeria, when a landlord tells you that his house rent is 1 million naira, the landlord assumes that the 1 million naira is net of withholding tax. So once the agreement says 1 million net of withholding tax, it means that that 1 million in the hands of the landlord is actually 90%. So you must gross up that 1 million so that you can get to the full value of the rent payable. Now, I know this sounds a bit confusing, but the principle is very simple. If the landlord says my rent of 1 million naira is net of withholding tax, and we know that withholding tax is, for example, 10%, what the landlord is saying is that consider it that you have already deducted the 10% before giving me 1 million. I want to receive 1 million cash into my account. So you then have an obligation under the law to remit the withholding tax that presumably has been deducted on the 1 million. So you will then need to recalculate the total value of the rent, so that by the time you deduct the withholding tax at 10%, then the net figure you will have will take you back to the 1 million. So how do we treat this in OdooSME? I'll just show us shortly. The first thing to do is to look at your withholding tax on rent setup. So I'll go back to withholding tax rent 10%. Okay, so my setup here, I don't want to add 10% on my service. I actually want to deduct it, because I want to deduct a certain tax. I want to deduct a certain tax from an invoice value so that I can get to the net amount the landlord of the property is asking for. So my tax computation basis is still going to be on percentage of price, but my amount will now be minus 10% if 10% is the withholding tax rate on rent. So let's save that. And then let's go to the landlord's invoice. So I go to purchases, I go to vendor bills. I've already created an example for us here, so I will use that to explain very quickly. Of course, you fill the vendor name, and then you come, let's put this in edit so that it looks like we're creating one fresh one. You enter the rent, the description of the rent, rent on 123 Johnson Road for 1 year, net of withholding tax. Okay, and of course the account to debit, because we are going to credit the vendor's account, the account to debit will be the prepaid rent account or the prepayments account, which is in the balance sheet. Now, the example we're looking at is a situation where the landlord is demanding 1 million naira as net rent payable. To then gross that up to determine the actual value of the rent, you will then take this 1 million naira and divide it by 0.9. If 10% is the rent amount that has been presumably deducted, that means that this 1 million represents 90% in the hand of the landlord. So what you will do is to get back to 100%, just divide this 1 million divided by 90%, or 1 million divided by 0.9. That will give us that figure of 1,111,811 naira and 11 kobo. And then in my taxes, I will choose that withholding tax rent of 10% that we set up earlier on. And let's just try to save that. The system will calculate the tax amount, okay, of 10% out of this gross figure, and it takes us back to the 1 million that the landlord is expecting as rent. Now, remember that we are doing this at the point of invoice. Why? Because we already know the withholding tax that is being deducted in this amount. One of the reasons why we will do withholding tax at time of payment is because it is actually based on what we pay to our vendor or what our customers pay to us. So also, you won't know how much is deducted until you have received a remittance advice. But in this particular case, we know, for example, in Nigeria that withholding tax on rent is 10%. So when a landlord says, I'm expecting a particular amount, and that is the net amount payable, so we can just assume that the withholding tax is 10%, so that we book that liability upfront, and we can settle it as we pay the landlord or the vendor. So I'm going to validate that invoice. And once I do that, let's look at the entries that are generated. If I go to journal entries, just to look at that invoice. So what the system has done is to do a debit to my prepaid accounts for that full amount of 1.11 blah blah blah, and then a liability of 10% of that value to withholding tax payable. And then of course the landlord, which is accounts payable, is due to be paid 1 million naira. Now what I'm going to do next is to try to pay this particular amount. So I'm going to go back to my vendor bills, and it says the 1 million is what is due to be paid. So let's pay that 1 million. We're paying the landlord now. So I'm going to register payment. Okay, and again I will choose Zenith Bank, and I'm paying that entire 1 million. So it's not asking me, to keep something open or to completely, reconcile to an account if there is a balance. So it's the exact amount that I want to pay. So I say validate. Okay, so that invoice will now show as paid, but we can again look at the journal entries that are raised. Remember, what I've done now is I've paid the landlord. My liability to the landlord through the deductions that I'm going to make to government is still pending. So let's look at the journal entries. If I take that filter out, so I have a second journal. So let's look at that journal. Very straightforward. It basically just debits the accounts payable, to more or less just cancel out that liability to the vendor, and then it credits the bank account. This is all you need to know when it comes to dealing with withholding taxes, whether they be deductions from your vendor payments or the deductions that your customers have made from your payment. Remember, withholding tax is an advance payment of corporate income tax. It is not the same thing as value added tax, which is a tax on consumption, and you cannot, swap both of them. You can't use one to replace the other. I hope you have enjoyed watching this video. If you have any questions or queries regarding this video or any other video that you have watched in the past, please visit our website at www.OdooSME.com. Go right down to the bottom corner here, click on it. If our agents or support team are online, they'll be very happy to take all of your questions. Thank you very much, and see you in the next video.